Okay, we are at the top of the hour and we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick Ahrens and I'm the Vice President of Innovation at RELA, and I'm excited to welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is our fourth in our Retail Asset Protection webinar series. And the content was obviously originally developed for our AP conference. And while we were disappointed to not be able to do that in person for very obvious reasons, we are so glad and excited to be able to share this content with those of you who are viewing here live right now and those of you who will be able to view the recordings as those are distributed. So we are just really pumped and excited to talk about a very interesting topic, a very timely topic. But before we get started with our conversation with Jay and Brenda, we are going to, of course, do a little bit of housekeeping because that's what you have to do. So our first thing is antitrust. RELA operates by both the letter and the spirit of all antitrust laws. Our content has already been reviewed. We've linked our full antitrust policy statement in the chat box. So please stop us if anything comes up, but this conversation should be in full compliance. Second is a challenge to retailers. We would like you to begin thinking about the content that might be ready for next year's conference. We want to make sure that that all those great companies that step up each year continue to do so. And so we welcome your proposals. What are your success stories that you can share? What are the lessons learned that you can share with your peers? Who are the really great speakers at your company? The people you say, man, she should really be up there because she is awesome. And I get super excited every time she talks. And so if you've identified those folks, make sure that you let us know too, so that we can highlight them in front of the entire industry, in front of the leaders of this industry. So the call for proposal is now open. You can see the link in the chat box as we speak. And we really hope that you provide us that. So with that out of the way, I think we are ready to start our conversation. And I hope you are as excited as I am to talk about facial recognition, to talk about the contours of that world. And we have some really good folks here to help us. Their bios were distributed before, so I'm not going to exhaust everyone with them, but needless to say, we are joined by two experts in this space. Brenda is the Senior Counsel and Director, and she's on my left in the camera, so I'm pointing to her in my camera, but I don't know if that's how you guys see it. But Brenda she oversees she's the Director of Artificial Intelligence and Ethics at the Future of Privacy Forum. She oversees the development of privacy analysis of AI, machine learning technologies. She manages the FPF portfolio on biometrics, digital identity, and especially facial recognition. So she really has worked across a suite of technology and a suite of issues that are incredibly relevant to this conversation, and look forward to hearing from Brenda. And then Jay, and I'm pointing to Jay on this side of me, I hope he is on your screen too. Jay is the Senior Policy Analyst with the American Civil Liberties Union, so the ACLU. He follows new technologies, helps the organization anticipate, explain, and reduce their potential impact on our civil liberties. He's authored and co-authored hundreds of blog posts and a variety of influential ACLU reports on these topics. And so, I think he also brings this wealth of experience and thought leadership to this space. And the point of today's conversation is to provide folks who are in the asset protection space a real look into how the consumer advocate perspective, how folks who think about consumer concerns and the things that will impact everyday people all the time are thinking about this particular technology and the kind of the group of technologies that are implicated by this. And we'll get into a little bit more about what we mean by that. And to help you understand what are those sensitivities, what are those things that you should be considering as you're looking at technology. Our hope here at RELA is to always prepare you to do the best thing for your company, and understanding the playing field, understanding the different dynamics, and going deeper to really be strategic thinkers is what we're trying to do. And so that is our hope for this conversation, is to help you think differently, to hear something that's different than you might hear from facial recognition or other technology vendor, something that's different than you might hear from other asset protection professionals who you interact with on a regular basis. This is a unique conversation that we hope to have and bring to you. And so with that out of the way, Brenda and Jay, let me start by having you talk just a little bit about each of your organizations and your approach to this suite of issues and this set of technologies, because I think that there are some preconceptions, whether it's about the ACLU or otherwise, that are out there from this audience that, you know, we want to make sure that we understand kind of where you guys come from and what you're trying to accomplish in this space. So maybe Brenda, let's start with you, and then Jay, will have you go second.
Sorry, I always have to remember to unmute myself. Thanks, Nick. Very much appreciate the chance to come and talk with you today and with Jay. Jay and I have been on many events together on this and similar topics, and it's always a great conversation, and I always learn something too. So really appreciate the opportunity to share with your members today. Future of Privacy Forum is, a think tank here in DC, and we're focused on the commercial applications of data, consumer technologies, or technologies that collect consumer data, and really interested in what companies do with the data that they collect, how that's made aware to the consumers, and so forth. So in regards to facial recognition technology, we've been working on this for a couple of years now and put out about a year and a half, going on 2 years ago now, privacy principles on facial recognition technology in consumer applications specifically, because obviously there's a lot of different implications for it there than in uses by law enforcement. And, we have opinions there. We've made statements for the record and things like that as well. But our focus has been on how companies, private companies, retailers, technology developers, online vendors, anybody that uses it in a consumer facing way can do that. And one of our primary goals always in starting the conversation is to ensure that people are very precise and specific about the technology that we're talking about, especially right now with facial recognition, that term, that phrase getting so much attention in the media and everywhere else, and rightfully so. There's a lot of things that get lumped in under that. And it's really important, if we're going to get down into the nitty gritty of policies or legislation or regulatory restrictions or anything like that, that we're pretty specific about what uses we're talking about and what technology. So a system that just detects whether people are present or not obviously has a very different implication and risk than does a system that is seeking to identify people based on a huge database of faces that might be available. One of the emerging technologies right now is along the lines of characterization or emotion detection, which is to say they're not necessarily trying to identify the person by putting a name or connecting them to an existing record of personal information, but they're trying to make assumptions about people based on anything that's perhaps seems obvious, like maybe a gender assumption or, even just height, weight, glasses, no glasses, things like that. But then there's also a lot of more subtle interpretations being made based on facial expression or stance or movement, even some medical data potentially being collected based on, various aspects in physiology. And there's a lot of concern about that. There's a lot of very bad science or lack of science behind that. And yet it's moving forward and being used in a lot of ways that are raising concerns in the privacy sphere. So that's kind of where we start. And I'm sure more of that will come up today as we talk, but trying to be particular about what technology we're talking about, what it actually does, and what the risks are that then can be addressed either by not using it or using it in some protected way.
Excellent. Thanks, Brenda. How about you, Jay?
You're muted, Jay.
Mute. We're playing Zoom bingo now.
Yeah, inevitable. Every single webinar has to have somebody does that, right? So at the ACLU, we're just celebrating our 100th anniversary. We were founded in 1920 in a period where people were being thrown in prison for writing letters to the editor opposing U.S. entry into World War I. And there were huge labor battles in which people were fighting and dying for measures like the 5-day work week. Information was being collected about labor activists. And the ACLU continued on through the McCarthy era and through the civil rights movement and Vietnam protests and 9/11. I myself started at the ACLU 5 weeks before 9/11, and all the turmoil that followed that. I think traditionally we've been a little bit more focused on the government side than on the corporate side, but we do care about our privacy vis-a-vis corporations as well as government agencies. And in my role in our technology project really asks the question: who does technology serve? Who does it empower? Is it individuals or is it large government agencies and large companies? And we want to make sure that, insofar as new technologies do shift power balances in our society, that there are checks and balances that are commensurate with the power. I think our founding fathers recognized that the more power a government agency has, the more checks and balances you need in place to restrain that power, because people are not reliable. Human beings are not reliable, and I think that the same holds true with other powerful forces in our society, such as companies, especially large, powerful, wealthy companies, which do have the potential to intrude upon people's rights, although they don't have the potential to put you in jail the way a government agency does.
And many of those companies are on this webinar right now. So recognizing that, I think what you highlight is we have great responsibility. And so let's delve into the topic a little bit more so that those folks who are working for those very large companies can make good decisions and think through these things in a good way. And maybe what we start with, Brenda, is, we'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of the underlying state of the technology, accuracy and bias. And then, I'm interested in hearing particularly about the distinctions that you draw between kind of facial detection, characterization, recognition, how you break out that overarching thing that is called facial recognition colloquially.
Yeah, happy to. So again, I think the reason it's important is not just because we're being pedantic about it, but like each of these represents a different technology, in some cases, literally different programming, and buying one doesn't buy you the other. You have to, get all of these services in separate ways to actually have all these capabilities. So, facial identification, which is probably the one most commonly meant when people talk about recognition, is where you're trying to identify an unknown person. So you have a picture, whether it's off a video, whatever its source might be, and you're trying to figure out who that person is by matching the image against the database. And the database that you have to match it against is obviously, part of the issue that concerns people. You might be law enforcement matching it against driver's license databases, or against a criminal database of some kind. Or if you're the FBI, you might have access to multiple states' databases of photos. And of course, there's been a lot of attention in the press recently over a company called Clearview AI, which purports to have several billion photos in its database that are scraped off of the web in various times and places, and offers that as a service to its clients. And it's a little unclear exactly who it accepts as a client. That story seems to change from time to time in terms of identifying that person. And I think this is the use case that most concerns people. Again, rightly so. It's most tied to surveillance. People sort of have this idea that when we start talking about police and body cams, that maybe that could be like a live facial recognition type thing, and just not really out there being operated that way. But it's not to say that it couldn't, that kind of technology couldn't exist. Or that, we're looking at videotapes or looking at cell phone images that somebody's turned in or that people have collected, and then trying to identify those people, maybe they're protesters, whoever. And the reason that's important is because the systems themselves have been trained to make those matches based on the training data sets that were used. And again, I think this is something probably most people are a lot familiar with from having read in the news, that historically those data sets, and still in many cases, those data sets are very biased in the sense that they're not representative of society at large. So they might be overly representative of white people or of men or of whatever other demographic might have been included disproportionately, and therefore they're not as accurate on people in other categories. It is also true that in the leading companies right now, the leading biometric companies or facial recognition technology companies, that their systems are pretty accurate across demographics. And that's been validated by NIST at the government agency that tests these systems. And that's not to defend them and say, okay, that makes them safe to use, because an accurate system has all kinds of risks of its own, which I'm sure Jay will be happy to talk about too. But accuracy is one question, and bias in terms of how they're trained and designed. And then use is the other thing. So even if you have an accurate system, where are you putting it into? The mere fact that you're trying to identify protesters in some context, should we be doing that? So that's not a question that the technology answers. Even if you had a perfect technology working perfectly, that's a question that we need to be answering in a civil rights, social values sort of way, as to whether that's what we want our government doing in terms of trying to keep footage of protests, match people from protests, things like that. Other use cases that tend to be a little bit less controversial, not to say risk-free, are verification, which is what you use when you open your iPhone or any other device that you might have facial recognition and security. Maybe to get into a facility, you use a facial scanning system in conjunction with maybe a card or you know, a password or something else that you have to use. And that's a one-to-one match. That's where you are asserting that you are somebody, and the system is only trying to match and verify yes or no. It's not trying to identify you. You're already identifying yourself, and it's just trying to say, yes, you are in fact Brenda, and you do in fact have the authorization of whatever it is that you're trying to do. Characterization, which I talked about a minute ago, and detection, which is literally just determining if someone's present or not, are very different because they're not necessarily involving personally identifiable information. But again, they may also be based on very bad science, not the detection so much, but the characterization issues. And it is an area of expanded use, particularly potentially in the environment that some of your companies are doing. And that's, you know, it's not to say it's inherently all bad, but there are a lot of risks about it, because right now, the concept that you and I could look at a photo and both say that person is or isn't smiling, the research shows that we, even from a fairly common background and cultural orientation, don't always agree on that. And if we do agree, it doesn't always mean that we all think that represents the same thing. Does that mean the person's happy? Does it mean they're nervous? Does it mean, you know, they're actually thinking about whatever it is they're looking at and happy about that? Or maybe their mind is off, you know, wandering on something else. So all kinds of concerns about that. And yet those are being used to make assumptions and profiles about people in contexts that they may not be sufficiently aware of, or aware of what the implications for them as a consumer might be.
I guess I would just echo a couple of the points that Brenda made, which is, you know, number one, yes. I mean, for us, the number one threat scenario here is that face recognition builds into a larger societal sort of big brother tracking network. That the little pieces that are being built now eventually compile into a pretty comprehensive infrastructure for tracking and control, meaning that, like, basically you are walking around with your passport on your forehead at all times, which is what face recognition really kind of seeks to do in particular contexts now, but those contexts we worry will expand and expand. I also, you know, echo Brendan that, you know, face recognition is one application of AI, and there are others as well, such as the emotion recognition that Brendan just talked about, and video analytics, which I wrote a paper on last year called The Dawn of Robot Surveillance, and about all the ways that AI can be used to analyze human activities and characteristics beyond face recognition. But there's no question face recognition is the big focus, and rightly so, because you know, identifying somebody you know, carries a lot of meaning and weight in a society where we've always, for at least since in the modern age, we've always been able to walk around in relatively big cities outside of small towns and not have everybody know who you are and remember everything that you did. And that era is in the threat of coming to an end. And, you know, the human species has never had a tool like this before. It's brand new. It's only been working well for less than a decade, probably. And so, you know, this is not just something to be casually flung around. And then I guess I would also, you know, just raise the question of, you know, on the bias issues. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the NIST report, which was much awaited, that came out in December last year, December 2019, assessing the bias in face recognition. And they found that the majority of algorithms do exhibit demographic differentials. Asian and African American people are up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than white men. False positives were between 2 and 5 times higher in women than men. And they also had a lot of you know, important lessons, I think, for those of you who are considering actually deploying face recognition in the field, which is that it's incumbent upon the owner to know the algorithm. The worse the algorithm, and the algorithms, while, you know, the most accurate were impressively accurate, but they varied widely. And the less accurate the algorithm, the larger the the bias issues were. And also they pointed out that every deployment needs to be tested in real world conditions. They found wide variance in performance, including in the racial differentials, based on the background of the photo that was taken. A light colored background or a dark colored background can have big effects on whether Black people were more likely to be misidentified or to have higher false positives or false negatives. And I asked Patrick Grotho, the author of the report, I was like, these racial biases, are these because of the AI training data sets are themselves biased, or is it because of the physics of light, lighter skin, darker skin? And he told me, we don't know. And that's just incredible that this technology is still sort of so mysterious at this point. And a final warning that I took out of that report is that the testing that they did and the measurement of the biases was not based on video. It was based on ideal condition mugshots. We don't know what the report says, what the bias issues are with face recognition used in the video context. So that's a very important thing that needs to be remembered. And so, you just can't have technology that's got these great racial differentials in it being applied widely in society for effects, for deployments that affect everybody in their and potentially in their lives. It just won't do. I think that report was very significant in answering a lot of, but not all of the unknowns around the bias issues.
So I think one thing that I would like to kind of address briefly here, and we can even pick it up later if we want to, but would love to kind of touch on the direct engagement. And I think, there's already one of the cases you kind of raised, or the name Clearview AI in particular, but, the ACLU has filed there's one complaint in the false arrest in Detroit. And then that case, would love to hear a little bit about the engagement you've already had, and then we'll kind of dive into that, I think, again, as the conversation goes.
Yeah, so my colleagues and my ability to talk about their ongoing litigation is a little bit limited, but my colleagues who are litigators have filed a number of face recognition related lawsuits. There is the lawsuit regarding the gentleman in Detroit who was falsely arrested in front of his wife and daughters in his front yard, based on a face recognition match with no real police work being done outside of the face recognition match. Even basic questions were not asked about whether or not this man could have done the crime. And he was held for 30 hours, even after the detectives in an initial interrogation kind of agreed with him when he held up the picture of the perpetrator that it wasn't him, even though they were both large Black men. And so, that's an example of the kind of abuse that we see. And it's a symptom, I think, of what concerns us a lot about, particularly law enforcement use, but this may also apply in the corporate context, which is just that the technology is often being deployed in ways that are fast, loose, and out of control. The Georgetown report found a case in which detectives sent a photo of a perpetrator to a witness, and the photo had been generated by face recognition. And they asked the witness, is this the guy? And anybody who knows anything about witness identification, the malleability of human memory, and how susceptible people are to having their memories changed by suggestive sharing of pictures, knows that that is a recipe for, for convicting innocent people. And yet the kind of safeguards and structures that have long been in place, for example, for lineups, you can't do a lineup with one person, which is essentially what this was. Those structures are just not in place yet for face recognition. And we filed an amicus in a case in Florida where a man was similarly arrested in a drug bust based on a photo taken from the hip by a flip phone camera that an undercover narcotics officer had. And the defense counsel couldn't get access to they asked all these questions like, what face recognition algorithm was it that identified my client? And how does that algorithm work? And how accurate it is? And how many matches did you get? And was the defendant was denied access to any of that information as part of his trial. So there are real transparency issues here. So that's one lawsuit. We have a lawsuit against Clearview based on Illinois' BIPA law, which is their biometrics law, which requires that biometrics not be stored without individuals' permission. We also have a lawsuit against DHS, which is a FOIA lawsuit, because we filed a FOIA lawsuit for information about how they're implementing and dealing with airports, et cetera, in terms of the CBP face recognition at the exit, at the gates. And CBP, although required by law to furnish us with the documents, did not do so, so we had to sue them.
Thanks for that overview. That's super helpful. I think that's important context for as we start to apply this into the retail context and start to talk about this. And that's what I want to do now is to put yourself in the position of one of our retail companies. I think my question, and I'll go to you, Brenda, first is, and this is actually kind of touches on a question that we've received in the Q&A, which is, are there ways of deploying this, whether it's one of the particular breakouts that you talked about, Brenda, underneath the kind of facial recognition umbrella, where a retailer could deploy this in a responsible way? Is that possible? Are there, and I think there's kind of the customer facing side, and then there's the back end, what I would call the back end side, which is, entry into buildings or things like that might be more on the, the back end part of the retail business model. So are there responsible ways of addressing this, and how would you approach it if you were in a retailer's shoes?
Thank goodness I am not. Yeah, so I think it's really important to maybe identify the fact that you just made a very important distinction there, which is the customer facing sort of consumer experience adding to the products and services version of it versus I think what you meant by calling it the back end is like the security purposes of it, whether that's like fraud detection or physical security of a facility or whatever that might be. And those are, I think my answer is going to vary in those two cases to some degree because the risks are so different. So if you're talking in the security sphere, which tends to sort of get a carve out in many kinds of privacy or technology-based legislation, because it's like, oh, if it's being used for security, these same things don't apply because you're not collecting people's data in a way to market to them or to profile them or to exploit them or, whatever the perception might be. You're doing it for security, which is sort of your own interest. And so you have this little bit of a gimme on that. And I think that's a problem sometimes because the risks of that are that if it is employed in that way, it feeds the system that Jay was just describing, which is to say it's tied to an enforcement program, even if companies themselves, of course, are not going to go around arresting people. But, they may detain people or start interacting with law enforcement. They can create lists of quote known shoplifters or things like that there's no transparency into, that the individuals may not know that they're on those lists, and they may have no recourse if they find out that they are. And the list can get shared both between locations of one retailer or between retailers without a whole lot of knowledge on the part of maybe really anybody except some sort of, internal level of security folks passing those around. And if it's being shared with the databases of images, which as Jay has mentioned, and as I have mentioned, the quality and the source of those images is very critical to whether they're really even valid or useful or not. There's a lot of risk there, basically. You're putting people in categories of, wrongdoer in some way and creating a lot of concern for that. On the flip side, so I would say it's much harder to do it in a responsible way, perhaps not impossible, but there's going to be a much higher standard of protections involved.
So can I probe that, ways you might mitigate some of the things that I hear from you? One of them is, in many cases when a shoplifter, for example, is caught, they often have to sign a no trespass, document that says I will not trespass here for some period of time, and that way we don't call the police, right? Like that may be something that some retailers do. Is that kind of consent where you could, as part of that, say I consent to being enrolled in this program so that I can be identified if I do cross this threshold or something like that. does
Well,
that ameliorate your concern, or does that, doesn't set your mind at ease? Or
no, definitely not.
Okay.
I mean, I understand the intent behind that, but as Jay mentioned earlier, there's a power imbalance in any of these exchanges. What choices does that person actually have in that moment? And can they at least limit and make that some sort of reasonable exchange, if that's a right term for it, in the sense that, like, who's actually going to hold that? Is it going to be just at that one location and facility? Is it only going to be for a set amount of time? Are they going to be made aware of any changes to policy or updates? Or if that data is shared, beyond just that one location, is it going to be destroyed after a year or 3 years or some other amount of time? And would they be notified of that? Is there any appeal process if they think that they didn't do whatever it was that caused them to be detained and identified to be put into that list? So there's a lot, and there are answers to those questions. Like, you can say, okay, yes, we will keep the information local, or the images in specific to one location only. We won't share them across locations. And yes, we will delete them after a year. And there are practices that you can put in place that would certainly make that a more responsible version of that system, and answer some of the questions. I think there will always be a level of concern about that because of the sort of lack of options for the person involved. But there are certainly ways to make it, maybe less bad or less concerning from a process or procedure point of view.
Sure.
On the consumer facing side, I think it's a little bit easier to say, yes, there are responsible ways. Now, there's plenty of people who would like to just not have facial recognition identification systems used in those contexts, period. And, there's always going to be that perspective, and any particular company could make the choice not to do it. But if they feel like there's enough value added for their consumers that they want to do that, our position at FPF and the principles that we put out and that we have, firmly espoused ever since, is that should only ever be by separate express consent. In other words, it's not part of the terms of service. It's not a default. It's not written into the privacy policy. It's a separate agreement made at a separate time. You're enrolled in the system very knowingly, because you stand still and they take your picture and they put it in the database so that they can match you in the future. And it's, very definitely an informed consent exchange at that point, that the person wants whatever the services are that are being offered. So whether that's like a hospitality kind of thing where you could walk into a big box store or into a hotel or check into a conference sort of seamlessly by walking past a camera, and that's a service that you want as a consumer and they want to offer it to you, and maybe they even want to offer you extra perks because you're in their VIP program or something. At least that's sort of a commercial exchange that you're a knowing actor in, and that you still need to have the ability to withdraw from that, to cancel it, to know when your data is being shared, what's being done with your data. But I think that there is a way to do that responsibly, meeting some of those criteria.
Sure, and that is one of the questions in the Q&A, which is, if it's for like a identifying VIP customers purpose, positive application for customer service versus a loss prevention or apprehension, kind of that maybe more negative side.
As long as the VIP customer wants it, not every VIP or not every customer of any type or category wants that. There are plenty of people, as Jay has said, there are plenty of people that want to be able to go through life with a little more obscurity, even in public places. And so they don't want to be a part of those programs. So that needs to be really a clear option, that they don't have to engage in that if they don't want to.
And Jay, let me turn to you and say, is there a scenario that you could, you're a retailer, is there a scenario where you would be in favor of using facial recognition or could envision using facial recognition, or is it a technology that is off the table for you?
I mean, the kind of scenarios that Brenda was just talking about where, you have some sort of fun service that depends on face recognition that people can choose with full understanding of what's going on to participate in, I don't think we have any problem with that. As long as people actually understand what's happening, that, there aren't secondary other uses made of the photos that are, collected for one purpose or what have you. And I agree with all the issue, the qualifications that Brenda put around there. When it comes to using it on customers without their knowledge or permission, Yeah, I think, we take a pretty dim view of that. I mean, again, this technology is brand new to the human species. It's highly controversial. People have a lot of uneasiness about it. Um, and there are real problems around the racial differentials. And so, we're not ready to embrace the technology. And uh, I think that a big issue is transparency. I think that a lot of corporate security people are used to, trying to make customers feel comfortable and not as if they're being watched, while at the same time trying to limit losses or what have you, and are used to doing a lot of things without customers being aware of it. But again, this is such a huge, powerful, brand new technology that I think if a company is going to start using it on its customers, they have to be transparent about it. And if the customers don't mind, then that will shake out. If the customers do mind, but you're doing it anyway, I call that kind of a little unethical, given the power of the technology.
Can I amplify the example? And it is amplified by one of the questioners in Q&A, which is, retailers wherever, retailers are everywhere. And one of the things that we've seen increasingly so, and there are other causes to this clearly, but is just growing violence in stores that are sometimes linked to theft events, but sometimes it's just, gun violence and someone coming in to shoot things up. I think there are retailers who in that scenario are trying to figure out, is this a tool that can help them? They're looking at all the tools. They're saying, what are the tools that could help us do something to protect our associates from that kind of potential violence, or protect, obviously customers from that kind of potential violence. And I think facial recognition is one of those tools that that's maybe one of the things that is at the top of their list, is like, is this something that could identify somebody being weird first or exhibiting behavior that may indicate they're going to come in to shoot the place up, so to speak. So how do you think about that when you're trying to tackle something that is hard in that way? How do both of you, this is really a question for both of you, how do you start to think through those really challenging scenarios that maybe the technology isn't ready to tackle that problem, and maybe you have to look at other technologies, or maybe it is, and there's a right way to do it? But I wonder how you both think about that.
I guess I would start by saying, look, for any technology, you can come up with a scenario in which that technology saves the day. The question is not, can you ever think of a time where the technology would help? The question is, how often is it likely to help? How much is it likely to help? How bad are the downsides if it doesn't help? And what are the other side effects that don't, besides it helping this one area, what are the other side effects? The side effects could be, participating in a system that's a larger societal-wide loss of privacy. Side effects could be on innocent people who are mistakenly identified by a face recognition algorithm as somebody on a blacklist. And then, we have a lot of questions around sort of the blacklisting there, and where does that stop? As I alluded to at the beginning, there's a long history of private watch lists and blacklists in the labor battles of the early 20th century. Names of troublemakers were passed around, often meaning people who were trying to labor organize, complaining about work conditions, passed around among employers, and those people couldn't get a job in town anywhere. You can imagine a similar sort of technologically advanced version of that emerging. Again, with all the due process issues that Brenda was talking about, let's say I get treated really rudely by some bad employee at one of your stores, and that employee sticks me on one of these lists. I have no control, and now I'm not welcome, not only not welcome, but treated hostilely as a potential threat at any of the potentially thousands of stores or their corporate partners. What if you're going to use face recognition to try and defend against violent incidents? What are you using? Are you using your own watch list of previous incidents? Well, why confine it to that? Why not tap into some of these mugshot databases that are out there? Why not, start sharing with other companies? And, I don't know, where does that go and how does that affect people and how many innocent people get swept up in this? And you start creating these larger, these sort of bureaucratic structures of blacklisting that are larger than any of us. I mean, these things have a logic that are bigger than individuals. This isn't personal for us. We're worried about sort of big bureaucratic actions. And I work in a big organization, and I think when you work in big organizations, you realize that there's often a logic and a momentum that's bigger than any one person, even the CEO often. So those are some of the questions that I would ask somebody who is considering or looking at face recognition in that kind of a scenario.
Yeah, I would echo, substantially all of that. And I would say that there's an old saying about if you give a kid a hammer, all the world's a nail. So rather than saying, here's facial recognition software, what can you do with it? The question is, what is it you're trying to do? And is facial recognition, like you said, a tool that can help you do that or not? And is it the right tool? And is it a tool that carries enough benefit as compared to the risks that it might create? So if your goal, if the problem you're having is increased violence in your store, that is a very specific problem that you want to prevent, actually, is ideally what you want to do, because facial recognition might help you carry out forensic investigating after the fact, but at that point the violence has already happened. So the question is, what other policies or what other technologies or what other anything are available to try to address what the problem is that you're trying to solve? And same when you're even trying to offer good things to your consumers. What is it that you want to make a very frictionless experience? You want to make a very personalized experience. There are many ways to do that. Is facial recognition one of the really key premier ways to do that or not? And sometimes the answer might be yes. I mean, there is forensic value in facial recognition, but people have had videotape surveillance for a long time as a security measure without needing to do facial recognition on it all the time, or to have that always tied into some kind of facial recognition thing, where if something happens and what you need is an investigative purpose, then you can go back and look at the information later without necessarily collecting all of this data as you go and creating it. And if you're talking about using it preemptively to identify people ahead of time, you either have a lot of the issues that Jay and I have already both raised in terms of how people get on this watch list, or you're getting into this whole threat evaluation thing, which I am just here to tell you is very, very bad science. And, even if it was, I would have concerns about, even if it was good science, I would have concerns about what kind of society that's putting us in, as we've kind of alluded to here. But I'm going to just say that the technology itself is not going to, go bing, bing, bing. This is a guy coming in looking for trouble or not, in any reliable way that is going to improve your performance as a business or a facility or an organization over what you can probably do with many other tools instead.
And just one other thought that Brenda made me think of, and in the TSA context, there have been some pushes to give the TSA lists of like most wanted people and so forth, fugitives and so forth, and use the TSA checkpoints as a way to catch that. But others point out that having fugitives engage in in fights and having shootouts at airports or whatever. I mean, it's not necessarily the best place to like try and catch people. And there's an element there that could also apply to retail, which is there's probably circumstances you can come up with where it would be really useful to have a heads up that this one person is coming towards your store or what have you. But there are a lot of other circumstances maybe where you're just going to escalate a situation and maybe cause violence, where the guy was just coming in to buy some toilet paper and was going to, so I think that's another consideration that I would probably recommend thinking about. Like, do you really want to make your stores the place where these confrontations take place?
So I want to pivot us a little bit to what is happening right now, particularly around the pandemic and around COVID, and a lot of the conversation that has been happening on these technologies. And I want to talk a little bit about the kind of contact tracing apps, other surveillance technologies that are out there that may be implicating and may be something that is being evaluated by retailers right now as they're trying to operate safely in a COVID environment. I think this is kind of particularly front of mind for retailers as we speak. There are a lot of challenges to keeping people safe, and there have been different technology companies that have put together different solutions, and I know that folks are evaluating those right now. So, if you were to cross apply the lessons and the things that you think about facial recognition and broadly that suite of technologies to that environment, how would you approach it, and how do you think about it, those technologies? Are they the same lessons, or are they somehow very different?
I mean, I wrote a white paper on temperature screening, and basically, there's a wide variety of technologies for taking temperatures with widely varying accuracy, and the least accurate by far are standoff thermal cameras. The thermal cameras can be accurate if they're done right, very close, standard distance. They're very finicky. They have to be calibrated all the time. Some of them have to have a black box heating element as a calibration that's in the frame at the same distance as the face. The really good ones are very expensive, but for the most part, the standoff thermal cameras are number one, the least accurate by far. Number two, the most sort of privacy invasive. We have seen DHS moving to use thermal cameras for security purposes. They've done tests at Penn Station in New York and on the subway in Los Angeles, looking for people like wearing suicide vests or what have you. So there is concern that this is a technology that would outlast COVID and would spread. The technology is increasingly feasible to test not just people's body temperature from afar, but also their heart rate variability, their breathing rate. Some point it may become possible to do oxygenation level. Now you start talking about a lot of like physiological data about people, and we'd be concerned that it would become like the norm for office buildings, stores, et cetera, to start using this kind of technology on people, and that it would outlast COVID and it become a real privacy invasion. And also that, people will have their lives disrupted, again, unfairly. We're always thinking about, how innocent people are affected by, even well-meaning things that are intended to target, specific bad guys or what have you. But a lot of people have low-grade fevers because they have leukemia, because they're in menopause, because they're stressed, because they just went for a run. And sometimes those low-grade fevers last for weeks or months, and we don't want those people to be shut out of everything. And at the same time, we know that a huge number of those who are spreading COVID have no symptoms whatsoever, let alone people have COVID and they other people have COVID and they nearly die and they never have a fever. So the relationship between fever detection and stopping the spread of COVID is very weak, and most epidemiologists look very skeptically at the technology. I understand that there's pressures for businesses to reassure customers and to be seen as doing something, anything, even if it's really just theater, which I think is what temperature screening is much of the time. Obviously, it's legitimate to keep somebody who's got a raging fever out of a public place in the middle of an epidemic where fever is one of the principal symptoms of a deadly disease. But it's, epidemiologists are very skeptical of it, and I don't think it should be done just purely for theater.
Yeah, Evan Sellinger and I actually co-wrote a piece on this idea of thermal scanning as security theater for the OECD about a month ago. And it's, in my opinion, it's bad in every direction. It doesn't objectively do what it's supposed to do, which, as Jay pointed out, is to measure temperature, and it doesn't do it very well at distance and at scale of large groups and large crowds and open spaces. And even if it did, it's not effective in the particular purpose of this moment in time, which is to screen for COVID, because of, again, those same reasons. Not everyone who's symptomatic, who's infected is symptomatic. Those who are symptomatic don't all have fevers. Those who have fevers don't all have high fevers. The people with the raging fever that are ones that are most going to trigger something like this are also probably the least likely to be out walking around and engaging in retail or any sort of other public engagement at that point. Not to say zero, but their percentage as a representative portion of the infected population is going to be lower because they don't feel well. They're at home with a raging fever. The people that are out walking around are the people that are in all of these categories that are not likely to trigger it. So it doesn't work in what its purpose as a technology is, and that technology doesn't work in what its purpose in disease prevention is designed to do. And the reason I say it's bad in every direction is because having it there as if it did any of those things well can create a false sense of security, whereas people, maybe they come into a secure, what they feel like is now a secure screened area, and they take off their mask, or they engage in some other, less distancing or whatever other kind of behaviors that we do know have some measurable impact and very little risk or downside. And so they actually end up in a more unsafe environment because they've been led to believe that it's a safer environment. So kind of a no-win as far as I'm concerned personally.
You're not in favor is what you're saying.
I am saying that.
Fair enough.
And I'm not the only person saying that.
No, and I hear you. We have a couple other questions in the queue, and some of this I think we've covered a little bit. One I think that's maybe on point. I think you've kind of answered it, but I'll read it just to make sure, because I think they're looking for some kind of for you to opine on this. So let me ask it. So in an operational scenario, machine vision and associate recognition could be used as well as overlaid with the concierge service if it was opt-in. And in this scenario, the metadata would be restricted for forensic analysis. Is this a more acceptable approach? And then they go on to say, also, we are now discussing temperature sensing, which you've opined on, both of you, and also on mask alerting. So masks are a big issue in retail these days. I don't know if you've seen, but folks don't really, there's some opposition to them. Retailers really want people to wear them because they have proven effective, talking about things that are effective. And so a system that might alert if you're not wearing a mask, for example, as opposed to putting a person in having to monitor that. So would love your thoughts on that question to the extent that you can answer it.
In the current context, which I'll take the second half of all of that first, which is like the mask awareness and things like that, it seems like there's got to be easier ways to literally just look and see if somebody's wearing a mask or monitor whether people are wearing masks in your store than install a system for them. Now, if you already have a system and you're saying, is that a purpose you could use it for? Maybe, but again, is that really the best way to get people? And what's it going to do? It's just going to tell you that they're not. You're still going to have a person go up and, interact with them to try to get them to put their mask on or to leave or whatever, because people will learn that they can just wear the mask through the door to get through the door and then take it off, or, whatever other strategy they decide to employ if they're really committed to not wearing the mask. So that part kind of just feels like, really, is that, does that really gain you a lot in whatever your particular strategy is if you're still going to have all these other procedures as well? Back to the first part of your question about the metadata, I'm not 100% sure what is meant by that, but anytime there's a cross-purposing of data collected in one context and then used in another, especially when it's not only collected in a commercial services, offering services context, and then turn around and used potentially in a security forensic context, that's very concerning. Do people know that when they sign up, even if it's only this concept of metadata, which is what I meant when I said I'm not sure what they consider metadata? Is it metadata that you didn't keep the image of my face, but you kept a record of the fact that I was there, that I came in at a certain time, left at a certain time, used these facilities, spent this much money? Is that the metadata, or is it some higher level? Anyway, repurposing of data is always concerning. And so if you signed up for a service or system to get a more personalized or pleasant or quick experience, and that data is now being kept and used for anything else, even if it's other marketing or, providing other services to you that you might want, it's a concern.
So I think maybe the last two buckets that I want to make sure that we touch with as we're coming up on time is, first I'd like to talk about the connection between retail and law enforcement, especially for asset protection official, folks who are working in this day to day. Law enforcement is a partner, sometimes helpful, sometimes not helpful, but is certainly a place where they're connecting. And so I guess my question is twofold to both of you, and you can take them in whichever order you want. But how do you think about the nationwide racial justice protests and the implications for do those change any of the dynamics in this conversation in ways that asset protection folks on one side should be cognizant of as they're connecting with law enforcement. And then, just generally, as you've seen, government uses of this technology, and as they may approach retailers to partner, are there any successful partnerships? How do you think about those potential partnerships? Or do you think, those are potentially problematic and retailers should be very careful about how they engage in them?
Big questions. I think that the recent George Floyd protests have definitely recast the conversation in many ways. I think that there is a real movement that is focused on police reform and in a way that we haven't really seen before, and it seems to come and go every couple of years, but each time get bigger and build. We had Ferguson and Baltimore, and now this, I think that it does. It does change the conversation. I think that there is an ongoing reassessment of technological tools in law enforcement. There was a lot of attention paid to not only sort of the less than lethal weapons that law enforcement use, but also face recognition at protests, drones at protests. I think that may well just sort of increase the association that people have a lot of these tools with law enforcement, and a lot of this could bleed over. And I think a lot of people don't make huge distinctions between law enforcement and security guards at stores. Their roles are similar. I think in that sense, it has changed the conversation, and it's basically intensified the stakes around a lot of this stuff, and lent it an urgency and a broad appeal, and a sort of a historical role that it hadn't had, as everybody's just sort of drifting along before. Sorry, what was your second part of your question?
The second part of the question was really about, asset protection professionals and law enforcement.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, those partnerships and we have working relationships with law enforcement. And I think there's some question about, what those look like moving forward and how you would think about that as law enforcement might come to a retailer and say, hey, we really want you to partner in this facial recognition program or something else that they may be considering.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people in the civil liberties world have a lot of skepticism about those kinds of partnerships based on the long history in this country, which I think that everybody in your world should be aware of. During the labor battles, police often just acted as arms of corporations and vice versa, often engaging in vast, violations of people's free speech and other civil liberties rights. And so, I think a lot of people have an awareness of that history. And so I think there's a lot of suspicion when relationships between government and companies get very, very close. We expect, if there's a conflict between an individual and a company, we expect law enforcement to be a neutral enforcer of the laws. And unfortunately, it hasn't always worked out that way. In fact, some people say that basically the police have functioned in the 20th century as basically a means of protecting the wealthy and property. Those are some of the critiques that have always been around and are being amplified now, going back, because of the protest movements that are out there. I think that's a context and stuff that's going on that companies should be aware of and sensitive to.
Yeah, in society generally, the centers of power need to balance each other to have any sort of hope of keeping abuses down, so to speak. So if you have large corporate entities or capitalist entities in the free market space, and they are partnering with the government agencies that also exist with a lot of control over social or political or public situations, those are two of the places that should be able to sort of counterbalance each other and sort of check and balance or rein each other in to some degree. And if they partner together, then there's not a lot of recourse. There's not a lot of place to go. So, you have a scenario of a year or so ago when the FBI wanted access to a phone and Apple says, no, or no without due process, or no without, procedures in place, that we don't exist just to provide you data when you need it on our customers. And it turned into an argument about encryption and things like that, and backdoors and all that, which is, the application of those principles. But the principle is, we live our lives very digitally and with a lot of commercial interactions right now, and we literally cannot avoid that. Right now, you can't even use cash many places because they want everything touchless because of COVID. So, you're forced even more to use a credit card or a debit card or things like that. So your data trail is just detailed beyond belief. And the idea that there shouldn't be any sort of break of access to that between company to company, between company to government, I think doesn't really take a paranoid mindset to say that we would want to have some sort of friction in those processes, which isn't to say it can't ever be obtained, but that we want some process and we want some protections for people along the way to do that. I do anyway.
Well, with that, I think that was the final word. We are at the top of the hour. I know there are more questions that we had that we would love to have gotten to. And thank you all for submitting questions along the way. If we didn't get to your question, feel free to send them in. We'll see if we can get some answers to some of them. But thank you all for joining us. As you can see on the screen right now, we have our next series coming up on Wednesday, July 29th. It's free to attend. Feel free to register and come and join us. With that, I really want to thank Brenda and Jay so much for sharing their views and for their candor, and for all of you for joining us. We really appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend. Bye now.
Thank you.